There goes.
We're recording. Sweet. What's going on, everybody? For those of you guys that don't know, my name is Ben Fellows. I run Whoop Software and Testing Services. We do a lot of work in Playwright automation. Today, having a conversation with Butch Mayhew. Butch is I'm finding your title, Head of Quality and Reliability at Tild. You've been there for, it looks like, a year and a half. You were the previous director of software test at Daxko and have been doing engineering now for a while. So thanks for chatting.
Glad to be here. Excited for the conversation.
Butch runs another site on the side called playwrightsolutions.com, which is an awesome site. I've read a lot about it. I'll link it in the conversation or the description below, excuse me. So I asked Butch on because I want to talk about separation of concern in test automation, as well as companies who say, can't you just write end-to-end flows for automation, and the challenges with that kind of mindset, because it kind of works when there's like one or two test cases, but pretty quickly it becomes a nightmare. So Butch, anything I miss about your intro or background, anything like that you want to add?
Yeah, I'll just add I love testing. I love the community. I love helping people, and I love Playwright. It's been a invaluable tool for me and my team to move very quickly. And yeah, I'm excited to just share some of my thoughts around that, how we've utilized Playwright to do some of these things, and hopefully make your testing journey amazing.
Out of curiosity, how did you find Playwright?
So I found Playwright, this was probably back in like 0.3 or something in the early days. And it was like a blurb in the bottom of a JavaScript newsletter I subscribed to. And I saw it and I was like, oh, we don't need another one. I was deep in Ruby, Selenium framework. I had all that stuff going. It was doing great things for us. Cypress was, it was the new kid on the block at the time. And a lot of people were like, this is the best thing ever. It's going to kill Selenium, all that stuff. And it's like, no, it's not. It's going to give us some new opportunities to make test automation tools better. And it has. And, for those that use Cypress, great tool. You should continue to use it if you're finding value. But as soon as Playwright introduced the test runner, I was like, okay, this is more than just a Selenium copy or a Cypress copy, which, Cypress, they have the runner built in as well, but it's kind of like a really big bloated runner. When I saw this and I'm like, oh, this has the describe syntax, the id syntax is very familiar with like Ruby and RSpec. I started looking into it, and then I'm like, oh, you can intercept network requests. And I'm like, oh, screenshots are baked in, videos. I don't have to go like deal with FFmpeg and roll my own like video recording service. Like, it was great. So as soon as like all of that came out and then the test report came out, I was sold, because we had built all that stuff in Ruby, but it took like 2 years, with a pretty small team to kind of build up all these features. And now I have this thing out of the box, npm init, and we're good to go. It was great. So
it's one of those things that the deeper you get, actually, the more excited you get, because you realize how much is there, as opposed to like pulling back the thing and just being like, oh, it's just a complete mess. Before we get that much farther, can you walk through the kind of products that you automate on? I know, obviously, within sharing what you're comfortable sharing, but what's the
Sure.
ecosystem that you're automating in? Kind of what are you automating on?
Yeah, so our primarily product at Tild, it's PayFac as a service. If you're looking for payment solutions, like, feel free to reach out.
Good plug.
We're API first, so all of the services we offer are API first. So if you wanted to make a payment, we give you an API with a open API spec with some really good docs, so it's really easy to integrate. We tried to be as much like Stripe as possible, and it's really easy to onboard. We wanted our documentation to be that level, and I felt like we've done actually a pretty good job. So a lot of it is automating or testing APIs, making sure that the functionality still works, making payments, creating accounts, managing accounts, refunds, chargebacks, things like that. And then the flip side of that is we also want to provide a way for our merchants to be able to view transactions. So we do have a UI as well for people to interact with. Of course, we've got APIs for all that stuff. So we have customers that build their own UIs to display payments and stuff for their merchants and sub-merchants. But for the most part, like, API is where we focused a lot of our effort, and then the UI is, where we're spending more time now that we've got, all of our APIs have coverage. So, and we've been able to use Playwright for both of those.
Yeah, that is actually one of the huge advantages that I find, is how seamlessly it bounces back and forth. So, walk me through. I mean, you've been there for a year and 4 months, it looks like, assuming your LinkedIn is fairly accurate.
It is.
What's been the journey specifically around this theme today, around separation of concern, getting kind of the automation philosophy in place? I think one of the things I do want people to sort of think a little bit about is distributed testing in Playwright. They emphasize that no test should rely on any other test, which feels really inefficient sometimes, because you're like, well, wait a second. Does every test need its own organization? Does every test need its own customer set? Does every test? And that's really one of the things that I want your perspective on shared. Sure. Is like, where is too far with that? Is it like too far that every test is in its own organization until, like, where's too far in the separation Sure. of tests and so forth?
Yeah. So this is what I would boil down to, is that the hardest problem in test automation. The hardest problem is not going and clicking on elements or making API requests. Like, yeah, there's some learning involved, but the hardest thing is really just designing, how are we going to manage our test data with the system under test, right? So, step one in that is learning your system, knowing how the data connects to each other. And once you've done that, you can come up with a plan on how do we want to manage our test data in regards to the way our system works. And there's a lot of different ways to go about that. Our approach at Tild that we've taken is we attempt to create all of our test data. So let's just say you're a brand new account with Tild. So I can start with a new account, or I can use an existing account. We wanted to build our suite where we didn't have to build a whole lot of tests. Like, here's these JSON files of test data that we're going to use to be able to go and do our work. We want to be able to provide a username, a password. If that username and password doesn't exist, go create it, and then go create any other, we call it static data, or seed the data that you need that you're going to use for other things. And then we set that data to environment variables, or we might store those in different ways. But it's one of those things where if I go in to my env file and I go say, hey, I need a new user, we want to start with brand new test data, I can create a new username, same password, run our test. We're going to create all the data we need and then start using that. So, a lot of that came from, I want to design this thing so it's flexible, so it can run not just against my staging environment, but I can run it against beta or alpha, or, I'm not going to run it against production, but any of our test environments, which has really freed us up to do, anytime a build happens, I can go spin up an ephemeral environment and go run my test against it, or run a subset of my tests, get that feedback, and now we have feedback on that pull request, and we can go do work.
So then immediate pushback that comes to mind that some people have pushed back when I sort of say something similar is, well, wait a second, when you're seeding data, aren't you actually kind of testing something in the first place? So now why are you running actual tests that are around creating different things or creating different events or payments when you're seeding all this data? So what's the response to that?
Yep. I think, one, that's a great concern, because you are using the system and testing the system in certain ways. And, you could say, well, yeah, it's doing that. But here's why I would argue against that. If something fails in your seeding of a data, or maybe you've got 4 or 5 steps that you need to actually run your test, if you do not have those separated out from your actual spec file, this spec is going to say, hey, this thing failed, but in actuality, that thing may not have failed, right? So for example, let's say I want to go make a payment and I want to test a payment intent, or I can make a payment in our system. So for that, I may need a valid account. I may need a valid payment method. I need a valid payment intent, something I can pay against, and also may need a valid customer. So with those 4 different steps, if I go create those as a part of my test every time and say, hey, all this stuff is tested in here. The name of my test is validated, I can make a payment. If that fails, where did it fail? Did it fail on actually making the payment? Did it fail on the customer? Did it fail on this? And yeah, you can look at it from, what line of code failed, but like you're just making it harder for yourself in the end. So, we've really taken the approach of any of that setup data that we need that's outside of like our static data at the beginning. So we create a bunch of static data. We come to our test, there are certain things that we know are going to exist. And those things that we created, we actually have a separate test for those, right? So as I run my whole suite, I can see, it's really, it's harder with the UI, but with an API, it makes a ton more sense, right? I've got 100 endpoints. I'm probably using 30 of these endpoints multiple times to create test data and help me with my testing. But when I run that whole suite, I want to see that, hey, these tests that were actually the problem creating this data are actually the ones that are failing. And I can identify those versus, this test failed over here because something else is failing, right?
That's interesting, right? So that actually leads to another area of pushback that I see with Playwright sometimes in this mindset is the idea of like, well, wait a second, if everything's running in parallel and certain tests are dependent on, let's call it this test, but it's in the before each statement, right? This test has before each stuff that's running, and it's all going to say, let's create customer, right? Well, you're going to have this cascading failure of a bunch of tests that are failing, not because of cascading, not because of the test, but because the before each statement is failing. And then you have the one test, which is, or let's say multiple tests around the create customer, and that is the one that's failing. How do you sort out that data, right? Or is it like, do you have reports where you say, like, I only want to see something that fails in the test, not the before each statement? Like, how do you find the test that's the actual root cause?
I mean, that's a great problem. I mean, I have not really run into that problem too often. I mean, it's pretty clear if something fails, this is where it fails. But like, what would be interesting, right? If I had 15 tests fail and it's failing on this customer call or whatever, right? But my customer endpoint passes, right? That tells me information that, hey, the customer is actually good. It's actually something outside of the customers that are happening, right? So I really think that those things that do build multiple things, right? You're going to have a whole lot of failures if something creating the data fails, but it is somewhat like a needle in a haystack, right? Unless you can run all your tests and identify, hey, this is actually good, this is good. It's actually these that are bad, along with all these other ones that require these things. So, but yeah, I've actually never really solved that problem, because typically if things are failing, we've got people that are, we've got all of our automations named after birds, so we call it bird watching. So we've got our bird watcher who's, when there's failures, they go look into it. They say, hey, was it a flaky test? Was it flaky setup data? Was it flaky infrastructure? Is there a bug in the system? Right. Those are kind of the four different buckets things can fall into. But yeah, I mean, I will say, giving me the confidence, right? If I have customers here, payment intents here, even if multiple things fail, I still want the confidence that, hey, all of my customer endpoints that are done in isolation are actually good, and I don't need to look there. I can focus my efforts elsewhere.
That's really interesting. You mentioned ephemeral environments, which is something that actually a stunning number of QA teams don't have implemented. Walk me through your relationship around what we're talking about being kind of keeping a maintainable automation suite and increasing the pace of development, right? Because one of the other areas of pushback I'll get is, well, an automation is going to be broken when a developer is doing their new feature. They're having to dig through we'll call them false failures or something, like where it's just the need to refactor. Are you guys refactoring before the PR goes into the ephemeral environment? Where and how do you guys keep your automation up to speed alongside this kind of philosophical separation of concern theme that we're talking about?
Yeah. So, I mean, great questions. I mean, in an ideal world, we are getting the automation done before the development happens. That's an ideal world. That world doesn't exist here. We are always a step behind, or maybe 2 or 3 steps behind, right? A lot of the development team and development work was done before testers came into the mix. I would assume, like most either startups or businesses, right? You're somewhat playing catch up, whether it's learning the system, testing new things, trying to establish, your first automation framework. But really, once you come in, understand the system, you learn it, kind of where the parts are. At that point, what are the risks involved if this doesn't get updated or we don't add this. So, we're really pushing the boundary on like trying to catch up to like 100% on our API. We've got coverage around, right, all the endpoints, but on our UI stuff, we are still behind, but the UI is also changing a whole lot, whereas the API is more static. Yeah. So I would say for API tests, as soon as something's ready and it's like, hey, this is what we're going to deliver to production, add that test. I think for the UI, it's how deep do you want to go so soon, right? Yeah. I tend not to go too deep until, hey, this is the final product. We've gotten feedback from customers. We're going to invest the time to put automated regression around all of these visual elements. And they're not planning on changing in the next 3 to 4 months, right? Or if they're changed, they're going to be like small tweaks, no like big refactors. So in that state, we are probably, I would say about a month behind as we build new features. But when it comes to like new changes and using ephemeral environments, those are things that ephemeral environment gets created. Our automation runs against the ephemeral environment. We get the feedback really fast. And, we actually put that on the pull request that's out there that generated the environment. We have a way to kind of tag that and say, hey, things passed, things failed. I actually have one right now I'm looking at right after this call. It's like, hey, the automation failed. And I'm able to quickly go look at my console errors and say, hey, this page, this test caused a console error message. We need to go get this resolved before, we go further. And our automation test it. We also have a round of exploratory testing, right? We need to go click on it and make sure like the computer that we programmed to do this thing is not missing anything that's critical to the human eye, right? And so we try to keep up on it, but we lag behind that stuff. And when we do lag and it's like, hey, we've got all these other priorities, we may go and add a skip in there and say, hey, in the next 3 days, we're going to have this, fixed with the right locators or refactored to match the actual production or development environment.
So I can hear the pushback in my head, which is people saying, look, it's great to do separation of concern at the API level, but you have this nice clean world. You don't have to deal with UX UI. Walk me through, do you guys do anything like stubbing UX UI? What's your perspective of the value of UX UI? Because more and more, I think I'm realizing that UX UI, the value of the UXI is just, does the UX UI give the data to the API? Really nothing else. All the value should happen below the API level. Now, that's not a very elegant way of saying it, but walk me through UX UI versus API and separation of concern and how you guys are doing it.
Sure. So I'm going to start with the API layer. And I like to think of a lot of my tests, or when I'm talking about tests, I like to think of it as DOM to database, right? So that's UI all the way down to the database and then back up. So that's going to be like your full end-to-end testing with no mocking, right? There's also, interface to database, right? That's kind of really what DOM is, but you can also do the same thing from the API layer, right? So API interface to database and then back up to the API. Anytime we have access to APIs and we can test those, we try to put really deep coverage there, right? And we utilize, the way we separate our concerns, we built what we call a data factory. And really that's just a whole bunch of fixtures that will go make other API requests to get the data we need and return the information that we can then go use in the test to do assertions, to do, pass in this ID, this customer ID to go make this payment so we can actually have all the setup. It may only be 2 or 3 calls, and then have our assertions, down at the bottom where we make the actual call. We do assertions on the body, the response body, the response code, all that stuff. And then we also, I saw you put a recent article out. We also do a lot of like JSON comparison. So, hey, this customer we created, is this section of the customer body the same as what this response is going to have? And So, we've used a lot of that on the API. And when we started investing in UI tests, we thought, hey, like what is the best way to actually go create a customer? Should we actually go to the customer page and click new customer and type all this stuff in? And the answer is like, no, you shouldn't, especially if you have an API available. So we took a lot of the same data factory classes that we had built for a data factory that go to our API URL. And, we built a way to utilize that through our UI. So we may have our before each say, go create a customer. That customer goes, uses the API URL, authenticates, does all the things it needs. Or I think we actually set that up in our global setup. It makes the call, comes back with the ID, and then we take that ID and we might even just go to the customer/ID to start our test, right? So, our idea around that is we want to start our UI test as close to the finish line as possible, right? So here's our starting, here's the finish line. We go do the actions we want to do, and then we make all of our assertions, and then we close that loop. And then we create another test to go do the negative actions or the other actions that we want to test for. And doing that has been really useful because we know, hey, I can go create a new customer and do this thing with it, or I can't, right? And it's very clear, it's very segregated. Of course, if the customer API is broken, hopefully we already know that from our API tests that ran and like do deep checks on, those endpoints. So
now, do you fire both suites all at once, or do you order the suites? You just fire it all at once?
So it depends, right? So we have different repos. So anytime we have an API build, that goes out, does this build, it gets deployed, we kick off our API automation. We don't typically, we won't not going to run our UI automation if our UI hasn't changed. So all of that is built off of anytime a pull request or a new build is created that we can test against. We have a feedback loop that will update the PR. And then we do have a nightly, it's early AM scheduled run, and we will run those, but we do stagger those just because we don't want them stepping on each other's toes. Even though we built our tests in a way where you could run them together, it's less about are the test data results going to get messy because they're using the same data. It's not that. It's more our infrastructure is not, we're testing it. It's a staging environment, not production environment.
And there's no point in just like trying to like almost
force it all. I mean, it's not a performance test, right?
Exactly, right. You don't want that. Yeah. Can you come up with any kind of counter arguments to how you guys do it? Like, could you come up with a counter argument, or is it doesn't really? I mean, not that you guys have anything perfect, but I'm just curious. Like, if I don't want to necessarily only represent one side. You should never build end-to-end flows. You should never kind of like try to optimize or do any like it's what would be the
here's where I would say where an end-to-end flow makes sense. If you want to write a smoke test that goes in test production, an end-to-end flow is magnificent, right? Because you're going to go do this, something with a whole lot of steps that you're going to get feedback on. And if something breaks, it's like, hey, something's broken for reals. We need to go, go figure out what that is, or, maybe it's a flaky test or something like that. Right. So yeah, I mean, there are places like that, I guess, where I'm so anti-flows is, I've made huge mistake in test automation, right? When I first started as a tester, I was asked to go write some test cases that other people could go automate. This is before I knew how to code and all that stuff. And so I went and wrote like 72 test cases, and they were amazing. It was, go create a login, go create this member, go use this member to go these 14 other things. And, the bad thing about that was, one, I couldn't run it in parallel because test number 63 relied on test number 3's data, same all the way down. And when I was trying to learn automation, if I ever wanted to debug that, because we actually had these tests running in production, something I probably wouldn't do again, but they were read-only type tests against a test client, and that was fine. It's another life. But in that, right, if I wanted to debug it, I had to go start my test, put a debugger hopefully in the right place, and wait 12 to 13 minutes for this thing to kind of go through all the different flows. Yeah. So, when I look at approach, I want to start as close to the finish line as possible. I want to shorten the feedback loop. And I think as you add test flows, which again, I'm not saying like you don't ever have to do that, but the longer the flow you make that, the longer it's going to take you to actually get that feedback. And feedback is important. The faster we can get feedback, the faster that we can get undistracted from like looking over here, Instagram, whatever, right? The better, because yeah, I mean, we're just going to be more efficient at what we do. We're going to be able to solve the problems faster and waste less time.
Last question, and this is something that's been top of mind for me recently, which is, for lack of a better way of saying it, QA with attitude. I think that it's interesting because I think too many people in the world of QA just get walked over. And I'm not trying to be insulting or anything like that, but it's the kind of, my perception of QA is that we're the smartest out of everyone, which is like, we know the product better than the product people because they are good at designing how it should go, but we know how it's actually going to be used. We know the product definitely better than devs, no offense to devs, but they're really good at following instructions, but we're really good at actually understanding the product. You have all the business people who sort of understand. We're the nexium of all this, yet oftentimes we're sometimes the quietest voice in the room. Can you give your perspective on, for lack of a better way of saying it, QA with attitude, and how to get an organization to think about QA in the way that you want to think about it, and any advice you would give to other people who are maybe in organizations that maybe haven't had the same level of success that you've had with getting your organization to think about QA?
Sure. I think when you look at, I mean, it all comes back to data, right? How are we delivering our code? How many escape defects actually are happening in the wild? You know, if there's not any, and you have a quality team that's actually helping prevent that, you know, not by going and counting bugs, but by having a conversation with a developer and saying, hey, like, how many bugs have we prevented as a team, right? How many risks have we averted? Yeah, I think having those conversations can be helpful, right? Looking at it from a higher level. I would say if you're an individual tester watching this and you're like, man, I just feel like I'm not heard, what I would encourage you to do is just learn. Like, yes, you may be an expert in the product, but you're an expert in the way the code is built. Are you an expert in the way it gets deployed? Are you an expert in the way, you don't have to, in the way these classes work in TypeScript or, Golang or whatever environment you're working in? How much of that have you asked questions on? Have you looked at Git commits and actually tried to stare and compare and figure out what is going on or what's changed between commits, right? If you do those things, right, you are going to, one, establish your person as someone who wants to learn more and wants to grow, but you're also going to hopefully gain the trust of some of the devs around you, which then, well, devs, they want to help you. I'm sure they do. Depending on the devs I've been around, I've been really lucky, I guess. They have been super helpful and helped me in my career, just in learning to be more technical, asking the right questions. And, when you're doing those things, you will gain respect. And by default, like, when people respect you, they're going to listen to you, right? I do think it's also important to don't just keep your QA goggles on, right? It's really easiest for us to say, like, this is a bug, we're not going to production, do, right? That's not the goal, right? The goal is put your product glasses on. Hey, we've got deadlines, we've got customers that need these features. Okay, like, if you are a project manager or product manager, which bugs would you actually be okay with us shipping out there? You knowing it's there, right? Have that conversation. Ask that question. Hey, I found this bug, but I need y'all to tell me, is it worth fixing right now? Should we wait to fix it next sprint to get this release out the door? In the end, right, don't look at your job as the gatekeeper. Look at your job as someone who can propel quality forward, right? If you do that, you will gain respect of not just developers, but people in product and, people in the business that are really just looking to help their customers, right?
Yeah, that's awesome, man. That's really, really awesome. Final words yours. Anything else you want to add?
Nope. This is great. Check out playwrightsolutions.com. I'm still working on that. Once a week, you can subscribe and it'll come to your email box. Feel free to follow me on LinkedIn, Butch Mayhew. And I'll say, if you're watching this before February and you're in the US, you should go check out the automation and testing workshop. that is happening in Chicago.
We're sending somebody there actually. So, and I think you're sending somebody there too.
And we're sending 2 there. So
yeah, so I've heard that's going to be awesome, and that is Richard Branson, not Branson. Is that Bradshaw? Sorry, Richard. That's my fault entirely. I choked in the moment, and he runs Ministry of Testing, which is an awesome blog too. So shout out Ministry of Testing.
And Mark Winningham. I don't know if I got the name right, but he's there as well. He wrote the book on API testing that you should also check out.
And then shout out Butch. Butch pushed me to start making content, so it was only fitting that I wanted to have a conversation with Butch first. Honestly, we've only known each other now like a couple of weeks, but it feels like much longer. So I appreciate all the advice you've given me on QA, and I think other people really will value perspective on it. All right. Thanks, man. Talk soon.
See ya. Bye.